Welcome to another edition of the On the Water podcast. Mike Waine, back again. Mike Waine from the American Sportfishing Association.
Striped bass means so much to so many people. Does it make more sense for the fishery to be more catch and release versus harvest? I think they are both valuable. Whether one is more valuable than the other, that is pretty hard to tease apart.
And the reality is, we're all good guys. We're trying to make sure that there's an abundance for these fish and there's a fishery for our kids.
How close are we to crossing the finish line?
Welcome to another episode of the On the Water podcast. Beautiful.
Let's go!
If you own a boat, whether it's a sport fish, a charter vessel, or a commercial rig, your insurance should be as reliable as your gear. That's where Lambros Insurance comes in, specializing in marine coverage for yachts, charter boats, commercial vessels, and marinas. We understand the water because we live it. Dean Lambros isn't just an insurance pro. He's a seasoned captain with years on the water. Protect your boat, your business, and your passion with a policy that actually fits. Visit LambrosInsurance.com or call Dean directly, 203-644-4044, and get covered by someone who speaks your language.
Welcome to another edition of the On the Water podcast. I'm Kevin Blinkoff. I'm here with Chris Megan, owner and publisher of On the Water magazine, and our guest today is Mike Waine, back again. Mike Waine from the American Sportfishing Association, the Atlantic Fisheries Policy Director. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back in here.
Glad to have you back. And so the plan today is we're going to talk a little bit first about ASA and what it is. We're going to talk about On the Water and their involvement with ASA. And then we're going to get into the big issue right now, I think, which is striped bass management. It's what we're all talking about. So, Mike, if you don't mind, we'll just kind of start with you. Give us the quick overview of the American Sportfishing Association, ASA, and why do they exist?
Yeah, so we're the industry's tackle trade group for the recreational fishing industry. And I specifically work on the government affairs team there. And so I'm tracking all the fishery policy discussions in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. And what we try to do is amplify the voice of the recreational fishing industry in those discussions. And the mantra that we adhere to is what's good for the industry is good for the angler and vice versa. And so we work very, our industry supplies tackle and fishing equipment to the angler. And so there's a lot of cohesion there.
You're the East Coast. Talk a little bit about there's 4 or 5 policy directors that we have on staff and the different regions they cover. I think sometimes the folks that are living in the Northeast, they understand who you are, Mike, but really we cover the entire country at ASA. And in full disclosure, I still sit on the board of directors at ASA and have for the last 12 or 13 years. But just go ahead and the different regions that we cover on the government affairs side.
Yeah, so ASA brought on regional fishery policy directors a few years back. I think that was part of the board's decision to get more invested in the different areas in which these valuable recreational fisheries are prosecuted. And beyond me, we have a Southeast director that covers the Southeast and the Gulf. And then we also have a West Coast director that covers the fisheries on the West Coast. And so we're really dialed in the regions. And then someone actually covers
the
freshwater.
central,
Freshwater. So we're a national association,
right?
And have staff covering the nation. And I think what might be kind of lost in some of these conversations is freshwater is a huge part of our business.
Right.
Like we all live and breathe saltwater fishing,
right?
But freshwater is huge when it comes to the recreational fishing industry. And there's a lot of area to cover on the freshwater side too. And so, I think it's been a good model to really help elevate the voice of the industry across the various regions.
I agree with you 100%.
And so I think it's worked well for getting really involved in these discussions.
And some of the issues that I've, during my time since I've been on the Government Affairs Committee at ASA, is the issues of everything from salmon management out west, water issues, freshwater, talking about invasive species, Everglades restoration down in the Southeast has been a big issue. Menhaden management, both in the Gulf of Mexico and in Chesapeake Bay. And then, of course, Northeast species fishery management. So a lot of different kind of conservation-related issues that you guys have covered all across the nation.
And many controversial, many challenging to kind of engage on. And this is, we're probably one of the more challenging regions when it comes to fisheries policy. Not that the other regions aren't dealing with similar issues, but you're right, there's a lot of diversity across that geography.
One of the things I found really interesting at lunch today was I don't think there was anyone in that group that was over 30, 31 years old. And one of the things we talked about the most was menhaden, the most important fish in the sea. And we'll talk today a lot about striped bass, but really when you look at menhaden, and it was actually Robbie who's coordinating, quarterbacking this podcast today, was talking about the new ships that they have out there, the new sane person ships that they have out there, and how destructive they can be, the swat that they can pass. ASA is involved in all of that as well. And I think sometimes people look at it and they, based on their region, it's red snapper. But the reality is at ASA, with the policy directors and the staff there, you have to look at it from the West Coast across, and the impact that it's going to have internationally with the bluefin tuna and what's going on with them this year too as well.
Yeah, exactly. Because we cover such a broad, diverse membership, right?
Yeah.
We have to cover all of the issues, all of the species. And so we're not myopic at all.
No.
Striped bass is not our
Right.
only species
Right.
that we work on. And we've done a lot of work on the other species in this region to help balance conservation and recreational fishing access for some species that don't have quite the spotlight
Right.
that striped bass has. But yeah, there's some things coming on menhaden. Maybe we can get into that a little bit in the podcast, because menhaden is actually linked to striped bass in terms of how it's managed. There's an ecosystem management approach for menhaden, recognizing
Direct correlation between the success of striped bass and the success of menhaden.
Yeah,
100% direct correlation.
Yeah, not only
between
do
them.
the anglers know that, but the science knows
Yeah.
that too, and the data support that linkage. And so they are actually establishing catch limits that try to help striped bass rebuild by setting menhaden catch
Menhaden.
levels. Yeah, so we can get into a little bit of that. That's coming in October as well.
And Mike, you mentioned that you cover a lot of diverse issues at ASA. You also have a diverse membership, all sorts of different, on the water is one, but there are many tackle companies, many different people from all over, and everybody has different opinions. So we sit down at meetings and try to come up with policy, make decisions. Not everybody's always on the same page.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, no, and that's the challenge, right? Is trying to deal with all the diverse perspectives, and I'm sure some of that will unfold during our conversation. And remember, we do not have the luxury to advocate for one person over another. We try to find what's best across all users and all members of our association. And the other thing I want to start by saying is, remember that our fisheries laws are intended to balance recreational fishing access with conservation. And I think there's sometimes people get caught up in that it's one or the other. And that's not it at all. The whole premise of managing our fisheries is to maximize the economics while creating a conservable, sustainable resource. So those two things are very intricately tied together. And I think in some of these conversations, when the controversy gets really hot and heated, people just view those as two separate entities completely.
Definitely. I mean, I always remind people, hey, at the national level, fisheries are managed under the Department of Commerce. It is about
Exactly.
And it is recreational and commercial, and it is about that and that going hand in hand with conservation.
Right.
Yeah, it's the hot button issues, right? It's red snapper down south and a striped bass up here, and right behind them it's a menhaden. And I would love to get into that too. You just said one of the words, economic, right? The economic impact of the fishery as well. And so when I look at it, and if we start delving into the striped bass side of it, I don't know the exact number, and you probably know, but when you look at the economic impact of a striped bass swimming in the ocean versus being on the table, there's got to be some numbers there of the money that is spent pursuing the striped bass versus the money that is going to be spent on harvesting them and putting them on the table. Just talk a little bit about that economic impact. I'm not sure where striped bass falls in relation to that of the red snapper, but they got to be 1 and 2.
Yeah, no, the economics for the striper fishery, I mean, we have some more higher level economic information, like the fishery, the recreational fishery being having like a 13 billion economic impact and supporting over 100,000 jobs.
Yeah.
When you try to tease apart the value of a striped bass in terms of catch and release versus like a harvested fish, the metrics associated with doing that are very challenging. Right? Because not always is it just black and white like that.
Sure.
But there's obvious value in releasing a fish and being able to catch it again. And there's also value in allowing the opportunity for an angler to harvest a fish and bring it home and feed his family. And so I think they are both valuable. Whether one is more valuable than the other, that is pretty hard to tease apart. And so I think it becomes more of kind of what is the angler's opinion on how they want to use the resource. And this kind of gets back to what I was saying was like, we have to try to balance all those users in some of our positions. And so first, I think striped bass is such a perfect example because it is an example of a fishery that has a lot of catch and release fishing by choice.
By choice.
Not by discard.
No,
where we have a lot of other fisheries where, like black sea bass, I'll use as an example, where you don't have a ton of anglers going out purposely to catch and release black sea bass. You have them going out
Table fare.
to take them home to eat them.
Yeah.
And yet there's a lot of catch and release fishing occurring on black sea bass because the limits do not allow you to take one, and therefore there are quite a few discards associated with that. And so that's what I mean when I say we're working on other fisheries to try to help get access where it can be supported, right? Those black sea bass is a really healthy fishery. We're working on trying to have better recreational access there. And then when it comes down to these fisheries that are in rebuilding, like striped bass, that's where the dynamic can get really challenging because of the users wanting to catch and release versus wanting to harvest.
Why don't you lay out like what the proposals are right now for the folks sitting at home that are listening to this right now, the proposals that are on the table right now. You know, I think there's 4 different, what they're looking at, the different addendums and such. Lay those things out as far as what they look at and where ASA falls on that.
Yeah, so geez, that's a loaded question. You want to take them one at a time, and that way I don't have to talk for 20 minutes straight.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's start with just a real quick overview of where are we at right now with striped bass.
Yeah, so we're in a rebuilding plan on striped bass. We have a 2029 deadline. That 2029 rebuilding deadline is part of the fishery management plan. So the managers are working towards successfully rebuilding the population of striped bass by 2029. As we get closer to that date, it becomes more challenging in what needs to occur to make sure that gets accomplished, right? Like if you're traveling down the road trying to find a destination, the closer you get to that destination, the more course correction you'll have to do if you're not on track. So right now, we are in a positive rebuilding trend, meaning the population is projected to increase in a biomass level towards that rebuilding target. Now, the date and that which we cross that target is important. And so every single year that goes by, we've put ourselves in a scenario where we start reevaluating how close are we to crossing the finish line.
So we need to move the finish line.
Right. Or well, the plan doesn't allow moving the finish line.
Well, there's a new plan that starts, in a sense, the finish line. Because I can tell you the last 20-something years how many times I've heard, we are building towards 2013. We are building towards 2018, right?
Well, we haven't technically been in a rebuilding plan until 2019. And there's so much to talk about when you kind of try to unpack, should we have been in rebuilding earlier?
Right.
There were big changes that occurred to the recreational catch data back in 2019 that really changed the perspective of what we know about the population. And so the reason I bring that up is I just wanted to reiterate that there's sensitivity with the recreational catch data. And in this striped bass fishery, a predominant amount of the data are from recreational catch. And so as that shifts around from year to year, or even when they did it in 2019, they shifted all the way back to 1981, they revised it all. That can have some pretty big or result in big impacts, on what our understanding of the resource is. And so kind of back to where we are right now, we're in a rebuilding plan. We have a 2029 deadline, and the managers are being hyper vigilant about trying to successfully rebuild the population by that deadline. But we also are very reliant on the recreational catch data to tell us how we're doing and evaluate from year to year. And so as that stuff shifts around, and maybe we can even talk for a second on how that catch data is estimated, because it is not.
That was going to be my question.
It's not a census.
It's not a. Yeah.
It's not a census.
You're coming back to the ramp. You pull up on the ramp and there's somebody there that's questioning you on that. And so, get into that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how that data, and because there's variations, right? You can hear some people saying it's off by 40%, some people are it's off by 5%, but talk a little bit about how that data is captured on the recreational side.
Yeah, so the way it works is they send out what's called intercepts, these agents that are typically found at the docks and the boat ramps. And as the anglers come back in, they interview the anglers and ask them, what were you catching? How many were you catching? Can we see your catch so that we can just get an understanding of the numbers, et cetera? And so that's what we call sort of the catch element. Then there's the effort element. So how many times do those individuals go fishing?
Right.
And those dock agents do not ask the effort element questions in that moment in which they're interviewing the anglers. Instead, that's done through a mailed survey to anglers that they pull from the basically the license database to send those surveys out. And they rely on the anglers to recall how many times they went fishing over a period of time and send that survey back in, and then they combine that effort information with the catch at the dock.
And Mike, how big is that window, right? Like, I can't tell you what I had for breakfast yesterday.
Well, they do it in two.
And you're going to tell me what you,
I know.
Kevin and I fished with Tammy out there in Buzzards Bay.
Right.
I can't tell you how many fish we caught. We did. It was great. But I can't tell you what that is. So if I'm getting a survey now in October, and I'm supposed to recall what the year looked like and what we did and those things. But the one thing I can recall is that I never harvested a fish all year long.
Yeah. So you're asking great questions. They do it in 2-month waves. Yeah. And so if you got a survey mailed to you in October, it wouldn't be for the wave that we fished. It would be
for August and September.
It would be for the wave.
Yep.
And so there's, I think the point you're getting at though, Chris, is there's an incredible amount of recall that the data rely on. Yeah. And recall is a dangerous thing to rely on, especially when you're an angler, especially when you're Chris Megan.
Right.
And so, I mean,
I said, I don't remember what I had for breakfast.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's remember that I think the take-home message is that we have to use this information. It's been deemed the best available. Right. But we must also recognize that it is not perfectly accurate, nor is it perfectly precise. Right. And I think as anglers, and we see this in the data all the time, actually, it's called integer bias, where you'll see the 5s and the 10s and the 15s. Like
these are numbers you fall on.
Right. Yep. You fall on. And so you don't, there's no possible way, based on all of the recall that's associated with the data, that it has the same weight or accuracy or precision as a census. Right. We're not weighing our catch when we get back to the dock and reporting that catch. That's just not how recreational catch statistics work. And so when I talk about our position that we've taken on striped bass, you'll hear me talk about sort of the precision in the data and the reliance that I think folks are willing to put on it, where it really, to me, is much more about what are the trends that we're seeing and less about what are the absolutes that we're seeing. Because we know the absolutes are based on recall, and we know that the recall has significant bias.
You know, it's one of the things that doesn't. It just seems to me that in today's world, recreational anglers are looking at catch and release. Like you stated it earlier, right? It's not mandated. It's just something they feel like they're going to do. And I just wonder how much of that is based on their anecdotal, evidence over years of fishing and saying, like, it's just changed. And so they themselves become a steward for this fish before they're ever being asked to do anything to that measure.
Shimano has rods and reels for every fishery in the Northeast, whether it's deep dropping the swordfish in the canyons, casting the stripers in the surf, or finessing panfish through the ice. That's about as wide a range of fishing applications as you're going to get. For inshore saltwater applications, the workhorse of the Shimano lineup is the Spheros SW combo. The Spheros SW is built with premium Shimano technologies like Infinity Drive, which increases cranking power and smoothness while fighting fish. The rods range from a 7-foot medium heavy to a 9-foot heavy and fit Spheros SW sizes from 5,000 to 8,000 for a range of lure and bait fishing. From the surf this past season, I used the Ultegra XR 14,000 XSD paired with the Shimano Tierlejo XX surf rod. The Ultegra XR is Shimano's most feature-packed surf reel to date, with the rigid cast spool support to stabilize the spool while casting heavy lures, Infinity Drive to increase winding power under pressure, and X-Protect technology to provide high-level water resistance. The Tierlejo XX is built for casting distance and durability. The 10'6", 1 to 3 ounce model was perfect for punching Ava jigs through the wind during a sand eel bite in New Jersey last fall, and it was great for throwing pencil poppers to distant bluefish off the south side of Cape Cod. It's become my go-to combo when casting distance makes the difference in the surf. No matter what you're fishing for in the Northeast, Shimano has a rod and reel for it. To pick out your next setup, visit fish.shimano.com.
Exactly. I mean, look at Striper Cup is such a perfect example, right? You guys used to be a catch and kill tournament, and now you're a catch and release tournament. And I think you guys have tracked kind of with this growing sentiment of anglers that they're choosing to participate in a catch and release nature in this fishery. And that's great, right? I mean, but by definition, I think it's moving us on that conservation timeline. And yet, I think where we're at, kind of to get back to today, it's like there has been a lot of progress and a lot of the sentiment has changed in this fishery. And yet there are still anglers that prefer to take a fish home for dinner. And so it's like, how do we balance that without forcing one over the other? I think it's wonderful. And it has come out of conservation gain that anglers have moved more towards catch and release. And I think even when you look at it by regions, like New England, and the data show this out, granted, like I said, take it with a grain of salt, but the data show that New England as a region is more of a catch and release region than the Mid-Atlantic is, for example.
We were talking about that at lunch as well,
And so, you see, if you had my job, you would see this kind of playing out in the management discussions in which New England is really pushing sort of the commission as a whole on this conservation continuum closer towards more catch and release. And the Mid-Atlantic is saying, we still have anglers that really want to keep a fish.
Do you think, in your estimation, that conservative movement by the recreational anglers in the Northeast plays into that? By default, it's playing into minimizing the amount of fish. So when they're looking at these and saying we need an 8% reduction or 12% reduction, that's happening already with the catch and release anglers, especially in the Northeast.
So I hear the question you're asking, and unfortunately, the stock assessment doesn't see it that way. The stock assessment simply says, what is the level of mortality right now? And whether that mortality is from catch and release mortality or harvest mortality, the assessment treats those fish as the same, but they are absolutely in separate buckets going into it. The assessment just doesn't care whether that fish died because of catch and release or whether it died because of harvest. And so what it does is says, here's the snapshot of mortality, and you need to reduce from this snapshot. And so it's not just the assessment doesn't say, get it get it from here, not there. It just says you need to reduce overall. Now the managers and the policymakers need to decide how that reduction occurs.
Right.
And even though there's been this conservation ethic that's kind of changed in this fishery, there still is about equal mortality in this fishery from catch and release and from harvest. And so you have sort of these competing mortalities that the managers are trying to address, right? And so that's what ends up putting, in a sense, sort of the harvest category against the catch and release category, because when you break that down in terms of mortality, they're about equal right now. So anyways, yeah, I feel like we're jumping around, but that's right. That's right. That's good. That's good.
That's what it is.
So just to bring it back to where we're at right now, we've talked about this. 2019, we kind of started the clock. We said striped bass are overfished, we need to rebuild them, and there's an automatic 10-year deadline. Is that right?
Correct.
And so the clock starts. We got to start rebuilding the fish. We start to change. Fishery managers, all they can really control, you can only control people. You can't control the fish. One of the biggest reasons that striped bass are technically overfished, that there aren't as many striped bass around as we want, is because the spawning success has been so poor. They're not spawning as well as you want them to. But fishery managers can't really control that. All they can say is how many fish can you keep, how many can you kill, how many can you catch and release, how many can commercial fishermen keep. So they started cutting back at that point. Where we're at right now, it's 2025. They're looking at, for 2026, a 12% reduction in mortality being necessary. And that's kind of 12% across the board. And so we're going now into this, what is called, I believe, Addendum 3.
Correct.
And that's saying, how can we reduce it by 12% next year? And where do those cuts come from? And that's kind of what fisheries managers are dealing with right now, is they look at, they represent all constituents, the nation. They have to figure out, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we cut back? How do we get that 12% by reducing? Is it by not letting people keep striped bass and saying you have to completely return them, a no harvest closure? Is it a no target closure where you say you can't even target them? Or is it telling commercial fishermen you can't keep as many? Or is it some combination of all of those? And that's really, all the comments that are happening right now, what everyone's debating and talking about is, okay, do we need to achieve this 12% next year? And if so, how do we do it?
Exactly. Yeah. And that gets back to what we were talking about, where you have these different bins of mortality. Mm-hmm. And the managers are trying to balance the users across all those bins. And one of the things that's been growing is this question about equity and kind of the conservation burden of rebuilding striped bass. And so, we have worked together to really try to help minimize the catch and release mortality associated in this fishery. We've worked on, you guys have done a lot of videos on this. We worked with the states and tried to distribute those videos to the anglers, to making sure that folks that no matter where they are could understand kind of best handling practices.
So, like in layman's terms, Mike, explain what you're talking about. What we're looking at is how you handle the fish.
Yeah, fight
the hooks that may be on it. How long you fight this fish. How you releasing this fish.
Make
the
sure
water temp it's in versus the water. Versus 58-degree water. That chance is much greater for the fish to live versus taking one in 73-degree water. How long you have it out of the water and such. How you're handling it and such.
Because the current assumption, I believe, right now, still in the stock assessment, is that 9% of caught and released striped bass do not survive. And that's based on a very old study. The state of Massachusetts is working on updating those numbers, and we're also trying to be part of this education of, hey, if we use single hooks, if we treat fish better, we can help reduce that number. And then ultimately you end up actually killing less fish.
Yeah. No, I think anything we can do to try to drive down that 9% release mortality rate will be a conservation benefit. And so when we talk about catch and release best handling practices, making sure your gear matches like the size of fish that you're catching, so you're not stressing them out, being aware of what your water temperature is, fight time associated with the right choice of tackle.
How long it's out of the water, that's a huge factor.
Right. How long, like keeping it wet, making sure that you don't, you're not starving it of oxygen when it's already exhausted from the fight. And I think generally, you see a little bit, you see it all, right? Like I think some people are really adhering to those best practices, and there are others where there's room for improvement. And I think the best thing we can do in that scenario is educate our community on how best to do it. And yet 9% is actually a pretty low release mortality rate when you compare it to some of the other species that are managed in the region. The range is really like 10 to 20%. So 9% is actually one of the lowest of all the fish that are caught or other species.
And the nice thing with them is that you're not catching them in depth. So, right,
Right,
when
there's
you're
no
not
baritone,
catching them in
'cause
depth,
it's not a
there's-
red snapper issue.
You know,
Right,
this is not an issue where you're bringing it out from 90 feet down.
Dragging
Right,
fish up
there's no-
from the
you know,
depths is a
Correct.
big
There's
cause
no
of mortality.
There's no barotrauma where the pressure changes and that sort of thing. has
There's also a
big
lot of using artificial lures too versus other more bait-oriented fisheries, so it's less gut hooking
Gut
fish
hooking
with
that
striped
way and
bass.
such.
Right. Yeah, and we even have said, like if you got to hook a fish, just clip it instead of trying to get it out. So, I think Massachusetts is really honing in on trying to figure out what are the factors that are impacting catch and release mortality the most.
Right. With that 12% reduction, just talk a little bit about the difference between that of commercial and recreation and that 12%, because I think sometimes people look at the commercial side of it and they're taking fish 35 inches and over. And this year, I want to say in Massachusetts, they hit their harvest number by July. Explain that a little bit to the folks that are listening that don't understand what those numbers look like, because I think sometimes people have a false perception that the commercial guys are taking 90% of all the fish in the water, and rec guys are taking 10. When reality is it's the other way around.
Yeah, the data say that the recreational sector takes 90% and the commercial sector takes 10%. And remember, the data are different between these two sectors.
Right.
Unlike the recreational fishery, which uses that survey design that we spent time talking about earlier, the commercial sector is much more of a census in its catch, and that when they bring their catch to shore, it is typically weighed out, and that's reported back as part of the quota. And once their quota is met, their fishery is closed. And so that's not how the recreational fishery works. And of course, there's opportunity for improvements on the commercial side. One of the things that the striped bass fishery went to was tagging fish because they felt like that would provide more accountability on the commercial side. So, and Massachusetts is in a unique place in that it has tagging at point of sale instead of tagging at point of harvest. And so there's questions actually in the addendum about whether to change the tagging to be at point of harvest, so that when you take a fish, you have to put a tag in it, and that helps the traceability of that fish and where it ultimately ends up, as opposed to bringing it to a dealer and then tagging at the dealer. There's obviously time between catching that fish and it getting to the dealer. How are we accounting for that? But and so your question was,
when you're looking at a 12% reduction that way, it's not like 12 and 12. It could be a combination.
It could be, yeah. So right now the document looks at taking the reduction equally between the two sectors, relatively speaking. So the commercial sector would take a 12% reduction, as with the recreational sector. Now there is flexibility for the managers to choose something less than 12%, but that's not the way the document currently lays it out. And so I'll just say we have been ASA, and I think the angling public as a whole has been very supportive of sharing the conservation burden equally between the two sectors, regardless of the differences in how the fisheries occur. And yet, because the commercial sector is managed with a quota and the recreational sector is not, the commercial sector has been provided more leniency in how the reductions occur, because they reach a quota level and they end up stopping fishing. And so because of that control, they haven't had to do as much in terms of conservation. We don't agree with that position. We've advocated against that. Like, because remember, the assessment doesn't care. Remember, the assessment does not care. The assessment says you killed these fish, okay? And so we need to reduce the level that's killed. We don't care who's killing them. Right. And so what we've said is, if you've killed a fish, you've contributed to the mortality associated with the stock, and therefore you should share in the conservation burden of rebuilding it. And so that's been a position, I think, that's been really shared across the recreational fishing sector, and one that we've advocated for strongly. And so the document looks at taking the reduction equally. And I've heard a lot of support for doing that from the public hearings that I've sat in on. And then it also looks at, as Kevin said, like on the recreational side, 2 different season closure options. One would be a no harvest, and the other one would be a no targeting. And that no targeting is the one that they call it an effort control. They're trying to control the number of people that are going out and fishing for striped bass, because that mortality is split approximately.
You said 9%. So if you're taking, if you're taking 30% of the anglers off the water, because they said, if I can't target them, I'm not even going to go out. And you're reducing that 9% based on the fact that you're taking 30% of the anglers off the water who look at it from the point of view of like, if I can't target them, why put the boat in the water? Why cast from the shore?
Yeah, it's not even lowering that 9%, Chris. It's lowering the amount of fish that are caught and released. And when you multiply that lower released number by the 9%, you end up bringing the catch.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
release down.
so it's not the 9%, but
it's the same.
You're doing the same thing.
Yeah, you're doing the same. The bottom line is you're reducing the mortality from a catch and release experience. And that's really, that's very hard to fathom. Like, how did we get to the point where we're telling anglers to stop fishing for striped bass? And this is a terrible place to be.
Yeah.
I've been scared. I think Kevin as my witness, probably you as well, Chris. I've been scared that this day has been coming. The managers feel as though their back is against the wall. They are up against a very strong deadline that's hardwired into the FMP to rebuild by 2029. They've got about equal mortality from catch and release and harvest, as the data suggests. And they've done a lot to control the mortality on the harvest side. Let me just explain what that has looked like. And I'll go back to 2014. In 2014, we went from 2 fish at 28 to 1 fish at 28. In 2014, from 2 fish, 28-inch minimum size, to in 2023, 1 fish, 28 to 31.
And just for those folks listening, the
that's
Massachusetts,
incredible. That's a lot of management.
The commercial side is still over 35 inches.
Yeah, and so I would love to see, DMF sitting next to us to try to explain for themselves.
Dan?
Yeah.
Dan, where are you,
And
bud?
he wouldn't shy away from it.
No, I know.
The arguments that they've made is keeping the commercial fishery completely separate from the recreational fishery through a difference in size helps them enforce the difference between the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery.
And you're also working on different year classes, right? You're working on different
that's the
year
problem.
classes.
That's the problem, right? Is that the recreational sector has taken action to protect strong year classes, and yet the commercial sector has not been doing the same.
We're getting into it now.
So, those are the types of arguments that Dan has to try to grapple with, right? Like, there's an enforcement gain, but there's a conservation loss by allowing the commercial sector to take those larger fish when we know that they are more valuable from a spawning perspective.
Yeah.
But what Kevin said, and I want to try to get back to...
I've got a notebook here and like a nice outline. We're all over the place. It's all right though. it's
well, that's what striped bass is, right?
Right.
Even though we might not be fitting it perfectly into...
And just to back up, we mentioned Dan. That's Dan McKieran. He's the head of the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. Massachusetts has a commercial striped bass fishery. It's run with a quota. It's all rod and reel fishing. They keep fish over 35 inches, and it's a season that runs. It starts, I believe it starts in June.
It starts in June. It can run through to September, October, unless the quota's met. This year, I think it was 750,000
So they keep track,
pounds.
and then as soon as they think they get to right about the quota, they shut it down, and that's how it's managed. We tend to focus on that because that's the commercial fishery we see, but there's also commercial fisheries in other states, and especially down toward the Chesapeake, right?
Yes.
And how does the scale of that, because that's something I don't really think about, what's the scale of the commercial fishery down there?
Yeah, it's larger. It's absolutely larger. And what we'll do is have these guys flash up what the quotas are across the states for this segment here so you can see the absolutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Chesapeake Bay commercial fishery in its totality is larger.
And a lot of that is net-based fishing, right, I believe?
Yeah, it's mainly pound nets. But yeah, it's to your point, it's not rod and reel. And so that is unique from Massachusetts, because I think you see a lot of recreational anglers, or that folks that would identify as recreational anglers, holding commercial permits for striped bass. In fact, Massachusetts has a lot of them. I think they sell over 4,000 commercial permits. Not all of them are active, but they sell a lot of permits for folks to catch striped bass commercially, rod and reel. But yeah, to your point, Kevin, the commercial fishery in the Chesapeake Bay is larger, and it's also harvesting smaller fish. And so
it's crazy to think about, right?
I mean,
it's crazy to think about,
Yeah.
you know, a striped bass and it's not a rod and reel. You know, you talk about nets and stuff. It's hard for us. Where we live in Massachusetts, and you said it earlier, Mike, about New England and how New England is skewed towards the catch and release side of it. It's hard to get your arms around that when you think about a commercial fishery.
Right. It's a mentality that just doesn't.
That's what it is.
And I think it's evolved, right? Like you probably remember. I mean, you might even have your own issues showing a different fishery for striped bass historically.
Yep.
And when you open some of the photo books from some of these photographers back in the day, it's like there was this mentality that if it wasn't hung up on a string, like you weren't fishing, you know? And so that has changed. That has absolutely changed.
Is it safe to say, and I'm putting you on the spot, which I've done many times already, but is it safe to say that
Bring it
your
on.
fear is that the way that it's changed from 2014, right, to 2 fish to 1, and people were about to burn you at the stake, to today, you're looking at more of a catch and release, almost, you know, before whatever is implemented, saying, yeah, we'll go ahead and do this thing. Is your fear that we're getting out over our tips? We're getting out a little over our ski tips here on this one, and we should slow down a little bit because you're saying the science really doesn't justify it?
Yeah, that's what our position is on this issue right now. And remember, people don't necessarily have to agree with that.
Right.
But the way we look at this, again, from an industry perspective where we have to speak on behalf of the entire community, we see a population that's in a positive rebuilding trend. We see fishing mortality.
Just explain to the folks at home, because it
can
sounds
flash
like
this.
we're contradicting each other. And what I mean by that is this. We're in a trend towards 2029 in rebuilding, yet they're looking for a 12% reduction. So the folks that are listening at home that are not in tune with this are like, this doesn't make sense.
Why does it?
Why do we have a 12% reduction, but we're skewing towards a rebuild?
Yeah, good question. So the 12% reduction is based on what we believe the
The
population
need is for this year.
will be projected forward, not this year, next year.
Next, that's what I mean, next year.
To 2029.
Right.
So what they do is, just like the hurricane modelers, they try to predict where the population is going to end up by 2029.
Right.
And what we're saying is that prediction is based on a lot of assumptions that make us uncomfortable.
Right.
Okay. And what we do is look at the trend of that population rebuild and see that it is headed towards that 2029 deadline. And then the specifics about whether we need a 12% reduction to course correct, that's where it is not black and white. Right. The science shows extreme amount of overlap between those two scenarios, meaning that you could rebuild under current management,
right. Without any 12% reduction.
Without a 12% reduction. And what they call those, when they do the projections, right? Think of the cone of the hurricane.
Yep.
When you line up those cones of a 12% reduction versus the current management, they overlap practically perfectly. And so what we're saying is, please consider the economic impacts associated with any closure, no targeting versus no harvest, and say those are going to be real impacts where the certainty about rebuilding and the need for the 12% reduction is not scientifically defensible, meaning there is no statistical difference between keeping management the same versus taking a 12% reduction. It's just simply based on what they project will be going forward. Now, I could get into the weeds. Do you want me to get into the weeds a little bit more on that? Because I could if you want me to. But that's kind of a general overview of where.
I think that's a great overview, and it really, I mean, I'm thinking back to, again, those days when we went from 2 fish to 1 fish.
Yeah.
And what's interesting then is it's like that was a cut that can make a big difference. I mean, you talk about that moves the cone.
Yeah.
And it's in some ways less painful. Now, I mean, there were certainly folks at the time who said, hey, I'm going to lose, people charter my boat because they want to catch 2 fish a person plus for the mate and the captain. And if you cut it to 1 fish, nobody's going to fish anymore. Truth is, like, most of them were able to keep business. It wasn't as big of an economic effect as it was a great conservation effect. And kind of strange now, as we get closer and closer, it's a small cut to the fishery that could have a huge economic effect and not so much, maybe not even a measurable conservation effect. And so that, if I understand ASA's position, like they're saying, okay, well then maybe we should think about, we don't need to make this cut. From my point of view, and I think a lot of striped bass fishermen's point of view, it's just this sort of, the knee jerk is, if striped bass are still overfished, there's not as many out there as I want. Yes, we're rebuilding. We might get there, but like any chance we have to cut back feels like we should. And that's, and I completely, I'm saying, my feelings and my thoughts about striped bass are not rational. I will completely admit that this fish means, there's certainly a huge emotional attachment to striped bass. I get emotional when I catch the first one in the spring. I see that first schoolie. These fish, it's our business.
I think a lot of people
It's
feel
the
that way.
logo.
I
A
feel
lot of
that
people
way
feel
too.
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you grew up on Nantucket.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
understand.
yeah.
I've seen the way you look at a striped
Absolutely.
bass.
I mean,
Like,
it's
there's a real, irrational emotional attachment to these fish that it's hard to look at them and say, all right, if the science says we should cut back 12% in order to stay on track for this deadline, which, yes, is just kind of an arbitrary deadline, but it's designed for the same reason we have deadlines, because we wouldn't print the magazine if we didn't have a deadline.
We'd get
Like
nothing else.
human
We'd be
nature.
fishing,
We'd
right?
get nothing else.
So there's a deadline to keep us on track. All right, the science says like a 12% cut, or maybe it does. The science is a little wiggly there, but like, the knee-jerk reaction is like, well, I'm pro-conservation. I love these fish. I want to see a cutback. And we've had this conversation when ASA came out and said, okay, let's think about the economic impacts. There's this irrational side that's like, well, anything for striped bass.
Keeping your boat in tip-top shape is hard, especially when it comes to upgrade projects. But I know a place that makes it much easier. Boat Outfitters makes custom solutions designed to enhance your fishing experience on the water. They offer tackle storage systems, bait prep stations, cutting boards, rod holders, and leaning posts that keep your gear organized and accessible. Their durable King Starboard marine plastic is built to withstand the harshest conditions and will last the lifetime of your boat. For over 40 years, boat builders and boat owners have trusted Boat Outfitters for innovative, durable boat accessories and hard-to-find parts. Whether you're upgrading your boat with OEM replacement parts or customizing storage solutions for a more efficient setup, their team of knowledgeable engineers is ready to help you plan your next project. Boat Outfitters, proven parts to max out your time on the water. Check them out at boatoutfitters.com today.
Right. But the question is, are anglers willing to hang up the hooks? Because that's the question being asked now.
See, you're going that way, and I disagree with that. I mean, that's a question that's being asked. That was asked last spring, right? That was on there. There was 2 choices that were non-target on that, and it's that's extremely hard to enforce. Extremely hard to enforce.
Absolutely.
You cannot
Yeah.
enforce that.
It's
You're
not-
out there. I'm targeting bluefish at Monomoy, and I just happen to catch 20 striped bass. You can't enforce it. So it really, and you start to look at it, it really becomes either a catch and release or everything stays where it is right now. And I know that you're concerned, and you have the right to be concerned, and we all should be, because a non-target would be just detrimental across
It would be a
all. It would be
crusher.
crash across everything.
We were
And
talking to Jimmy
you know.
Fee before this, and he said the thing with the non-target, he goes, there's no way, there's no world where I'm not going out there and fishing for striped bass. He was like,
Sure.
he said, take me
Jimmy
to prison.
will
He
love
said the
that we're
people,
incriminating.
But he
that's
just
across the
admitted,
board.
he was like, I will break the law.
Yeah.
I will target
Well,
striped
this
bass.
is and I said,
And I
It's
think
gonna-
everybody knows
if you
that.
go back and listen to the 2023 podcast we did, I said, when we get to this scenario, everyone will lose because it won't even matter
Right.
whether it's enforceable. People are going to feel guilty about going out and catching striped bass. And to me, that is how
Clearly not
we
Jimmy.
No.
And I wouldn't either.
But that's how we know that we're in the wrong place, in my
Right.
opinion. And so rather
one
than
thing I wanna come back to what Kevin said. Go ahead.
Chris, let me just finish and say, rather than try to pin our industry against one another on this question
Right.
about catch and release versus harvest. We're saying there is no need to do that right now. There's no need to do that
But
right
your own
now.
admission is it's an inexact science, especially when it comes to recreational anglers.
There-
The data, the variations on recreational, the
catch.
data on the
Yep, on the catch.
could be from here to here.
Right.
So
So
you use
we're running-
the
we're-
hurricane. You use the example
Right,
of the hurricane.
we're trying to do very precise management in this rebuilding plan with very imprecise data to
Yes.
drive that management.
That's exactly
it.
it.
Doesn't make sense.
So it doesn't make sense. But when you look at it-
you can't have it both ways, right? If you want to drive precise management like the way we're doing, you need to have the precise data to do that.
Right.
If you don't have the precise data, you can't do the precise
So
management.
two different examples that I'm going to give you really quick, right? Whenever there's a hurricane coming, because God knows I started looking 10, 12 days ago when I know the striper fest is coming, and there was this tropical depression that's coming off, and they start to show the things. And I literally took a screenshot of this on the news, looking at this thing, and like one model has it, heading way east, another model heading our way. The point being, whenever you see these things, there's the European model, the American model,
Yeah.
and there's many variations. And sometimes European is right, sometimes American. It feels a lot like that sometimes when it comes to the recreational data.
Oh, it is.
You know what I mean? It feels
No,
a lot
I'm-
like that.
I
And
know
one of the things that
exactly what
Dan
you
said at the meeting, Dan McKinnon said at the meeting in the spring, we started talking about albies and bonito. Not to switch gears because we're going to come back to bass. But
Land this
what was
plane.
put on the table, what was that?
No, I was just
What
joking.
was put on the table at the time was that there's not a lot of science on albies and bonito, harvest and catch and such, and what's being taken and stuff. There's just not a lot of science. But one of the things that was proposed then was, 5 fish. 5 fish that were going to be taken between, it could be 4 albies and 1 bonito, it could be 3 albies and 2 bonito, but there was going to be 5 fish. It was a guardrail that there people were looking at putting on. I know a lot of folks have said, well, there's no data on this thing. Why put a guardrail on this, right? There's no data. It's not based in science, but you're putting guardrails on this thing for the future because more and more people are targeting albies and bonito because, in my opinion, maybe wrong, that it's harder with the striped bass. Same pressure that is being put on tuna right now, right? The people that use to fish for striped bass right now in a 22-foot, center console can now go out and target bluefin, and they're doing it in numbers. And I think, and again, maybe anecdotal, but in my opinion, they're doing it because the options on the striped bass are fewer and far between. So they're targeting different species. Getting back to that with the guardrail on there, is there a world where those guardrails for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, where it's a catch and release fishery that way? Yes, you're saying the science doesn't deem it. Well, the science isn't even there for the albies and the bonito, but yet the guardrails were put on this year. And I think that was smart management. I really do. And some people may not agree, but I think it was smart management on that side because you have guardrails in place until you can get better science. And then we can determine that, wow, we really put on way too big a guardrail,
Yeah.
or they should have been much more conservative even, on
so
it.
your comments have perfect application to where we are. And I'll just provide another data point that, when the recreational catch data that we know very significantly is imprecise, I think we're much more comfortable looking at what is the fishing mortality estimate coming out of the stock assessment? Because although that relies on the recreational catch data,
Right.
it is not the only
Right.
data element that tells us what is the condition of fishing mortality on this resource. And under current management, we're at a 30-year low in fishing mortality. And you don't stumble into a 30-year low on fishing mortality. Like, it took very strict management to get there. And so the question I think that you're asking, Chris,
And how
is,
much of that do you think is through the management, which makes up clearly a big part of it? And how much do you think of that as a responsibility of the angler? Again, I go back to my conversation today. I'm sitting there with 5 guys under the age of 30 years old, and every one of them are catch and release guys. And I'm another question for down the road on this thing. I wonder how much is this generational in the sense that, like, I grew up, right? It was harvest 2 fish, hang them, look what I did. This thing. As I got older and realized I became better at fishing, I didn't need to worry about that. I could catch these fish. And then I got to the place where Kevin got to, which is it's emotionally just an incredible fish and such. But part of what Kevin's not saying is, in addition to that emotional, like you can't,
Attachment,
based on that, the attachment to it, you can't, that is the anecdotal element of it, of where he started with us 20 years ago on the water to where he is today, the amount of fish he caught when he went out on the kayak then to where it is today. So in addition to that emotional attachment to it, there's also that the anecdotal evidence of him fishing for 20 years. And sure, we're going to find these waves where it's in Buzzards Bay, where you and I and we were out there, and it's like for these 3 weeks, it's like, oh my God, every fish in the sea is now in Buzzards Bay, and then they move on. But there's that. So I'm just curious how much of that is the governance of like, we're going to do this, and the responsibility that anglers feel today of how important this fish is to them, how they have felt the way we've felt now over the striped bass, and they're going to do it before anyone's even asking them to do it.
Yeah, it's unfortunately the assessment doesn't do a good job capturing what you're trying to capture. Meaning, I think the point you're making is that there has been conservation benefit by an angling ethic that has changed and gone more towards catch and release. And again, the assessment unfortunately doesn't care. It doesn't care. But that doesn't mean it's unimportant, right? Because if all those anglers that you say are now under a conservation catch and release mentality, if they were harvesting, we'd be having to do a lot more. We'd be having a different conversation. So I don't want to discredit the fact that catch and release by technique has conservation gain. The problem is, it does not change the scenario that we are currently in. And that's a challenge, right? And so there's a judgment call that needs to be made here, right? And that is, even if we acknowledge that half the mortality comes from both buckets, like, is one more valuable than the other? Does it make more sense for the fishery to be more catch and release versus harvest? And I'm telling you, because the managers' backs are against the wall on this, because they've been pushed, frankly, more loudly by the catch and release community to do more to conserve this resource.
Because that catching community has grown substantially.
And not only that, and they say, and remember, I don't mean to, we're all the same community, right? It's just that the push has clearly been, can we make this thing more catch and release? There's more conservation benefit for doing that. The economics are better. And the managers' backs are against the wall, hearing that message and saying, okay, but we still have this large portion of mortality that we are not able to address. And so in this push in which our back is against the wall, and there's more and more calls for equity in everyone participating in the conservation burden of rebuilding the resource, of course they have to look at all the buckets of where the mortality is occurring. And that's where ASA, and frankly, like Kevin said, like, striped bass means so much to so many people. And yet at the same time, that's kind of what puts us in the position that we're in, which is we have to try to balance all of that interest in the position that we take. And that's why we're saying the best solution right now is to keep things the way they are. We're in rebuilding. That trend might not be perfectly hitting the target, like to the
so no 12% reduction. ASA, no 12%
we are not,
reduction.
Yeah, we are supporting status quo. Yeah. I think there's other things coming too. Remember, we're at a 30-year low in fishing mortality, and that 30-year low in fishing mortality is, in my opinion, much more defensible than the projections that are being used to drive the 12% reduction need. So meaning those projections are less certain than that 30-year low in fishing mortality. And then I'll just take it one step further. There are a few events on the horizon that I think is going to likely change what we know about striped bass, where the striped bass population is. One of those is they're going to revise the recreational catch data in 2026, all the way back to 1981 again. they're expected to shift it downward because they believe they've been overestimating the effort. And then the other major event that's going to occur is a benchmark stock assessment in 2027. And that benchmark stock assessment will look under the hood of the entire assessment. One thing we really haven't talked about on the podcast, I think enough, is this poor recruitment that is coming into the fishery. And so you're going to have a lot less baby striped bass becoming adults because of those poor year classes. But that problem of poor recruitment is not going to be fixed by a 12% reduction in 2026. We know that. The data is very strong on that.
And just so that the folks at home understand, right? The folks that are listening, they're driving the car and they're sitting there and they're like, well, just eliminate the commercial striped bass because they're killing all the breeders. Talk a little bit about the commercial striped bass and the breeders and such, because what you're talking about is the outside, influences that are killing this, whether or not it's, chemicals in the water, whether or not it is, the estuaries and these nurseries are just not in a good place to produce these big young of the year index classes.
It's true. I mean, we've seen really poor recruitment over the last 6 years. All eyes are on what the recruitment is this year. Yeah. I'm probably sharing more than I should, but why not?
Right. You're among friends.
We heard reports that the index coming out of Maryland, which is typically the index that everyone looks at to really be the indicator, is likely to be not as bad as it has been over the last 6 years, but not average. Right. And so it'll be another below average year class is what is expected. This is complete speculation. Take it with a grain of salt. It is not official whatsoever. This is just what we're hearing. And I want to take it a step further and say, because everyone's so interested in how the recruitment is going, like there were tows early on in this year that showed a better sign of young of year for 2025. And then weather events occurred and they came back out and those fish were no longer there. Now, there's any number, but I only bring that up
because a lot of those things you can't control.
I only bring that up to say that's how sensitive, right? The young of year class successes. These are baby striped bass born every year. Like what drives a successful year class is that environmental condition that we just talked about. And we don't have a great handle, nor do we have practically any control over how those fish
control the weather. We're finding out right now. What's right.
And remember, so what are we doing instead? We're trying to control the number of adults, the number of adult fish that are in the water. And I'm telling you that number is already at a level that can produce strong year classes, meaning this 12% reduction that's being considered will not result in better recruitment success for striped bass. It will not mean more baby striped bass.
You're saying there's already critical mass.
Yeah. And the data show that. So, that's really the challenge is like we're working on solutions that do not address our problem. That's what we're doing right now in striped bass. And that's going to need to get reconciled at some point, Chris, because you can't fix a problem unless you're actually working on solutions that address that problem. That is not what the striped bass rebuilding plan is right now. So, we've got a bumpy, challenging road ahead. Those poor year classes, this fishery will feel. The Chesapeake Bay is already feeling them. And there is a sense here that the lower amount of striped bass from those poor year classes is going to be felt so much by the fishery that the fishery is going to end up managing itself to some degree. You guys know this.
Right.
You sell fishing reports, essentially. Right. When the fishing reports are not good, the anglers do not go. When the fishing reports are good, it's shoulder to shoulder. And so the fish availability is going to drive a lot of this
I guess the
discussion.
only thing I might add to that is that in this world where, in this world where everything is instant, right? The cell phone is instant these days.
Instant.
So when the fishing report now is not good in New Jersey, but it's good in New York, the Jersey anglers will go to New York. If it's not good in Rhode Island, but it's good in Massachusetts, they'll go there. And so what you're seeing now is we had a gentleman in here, we talked about the different, I'm not sure what you would call it, but these different biomasses that would make residents off the backside of the Cape. These are in Boston Harbor. These are off of No Man's Island and Cuttyhunk and such. And you have this biomass of fish that come back to this one area. And so what's happening now is that because those refishing ports are not happening in Rhode Island, you'll see 200 boats on that biomass that's sitting off of Monomoy. And they don't mind traveling to it because they know that they're not finding out a week later in the magazine or a month later in the magazine in a fishing report. They're finding out within minutes of the person posting it that Monomoy has gone off. And the next thing you know, the pressure on those biomasses that are in Boston Harbor that used to be off of Plymouth that are now off of these, which are following the bunker, is targeted, that much stronger. Another conversation probably for another day.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just gets back to the scientists say that effort controls, the ones that tell people to stop chasing those fishing reports, that's where the conservation benefit is. And that puts us right back where we didn't want to be, right? It's like we have a very efficient fishery is what you're saying. And I experienced it myself. I went to Jersey on December 3rd, and on December 2nd, it was lights out, fish everywhere on the beach. I showed up and turned the bite off completely, and by 10 a.m., there wasn't a soul on the beach. Yeah. It's crazy how quick it happens.
And the flip side of that is that it could be 15 miles down the beach, and you'll adjust like that on the fly. It's going off in Ocean City, and the next thing you know, the migration just moves south. Not just the fish, but the anglers.
Yeah. And so that type of fishing pressure is what striped bass can. It's that same attitude, right? It's that same it just drives people
the passion that they
to
have
passion,
for
right?
fishing for these.
And we don't want to see that lost.
If there's one fish that's the poster child for on the water and everything we built here over 30 years, it's striped bass. So when I start to consider a world where it's just 100% catch and release that way, think about what I'm saying, right? Think about how many tackle shops or charter boat captains I'm pissing off by potentially making that statement. Potentially looking at it from the point of view of like this Chrissy year 31 and 32 with On the Water Media Company. But you get to a certain point based on years and years and years of fishing and seeing where it's going right now, that speaking for myself, I like guardrails on striped bass. Kevin's saying it without saying it, that he loves guardrails on striped bass because of the passion he has for seeing that fish caught, releasing it in the whole 9 yards. I can't tell you. And I'm changing only because of the fact, because I always said, I don't mind if you harvest a fish, put one on the table. I don't mind that. But when you have years and years of fishing, and there's going to be some folks out there, Megan, you don't know how to fish, because I tong as many fish as I've ever wanted to in my entire life. Sure, you're sitting on a biomass at Monomoy or Boston Harbor or Fire Island that's just taken up residency there because the bunker or whatever that bait might be there, and they're hammering that. 20 years ago, I could go down the Elizabeth Islands and I could take a marketing director from any one of these companies, a friend, anyone like that, and I could target striped bass. And it was a matter of like, how many fish do you want to catch over 20 pounds? How many fish do you want to catch over 25? If you want to go to 30, we got to go to this spot. And you could fish there 3-4 hours at night and you could catch 20 fish. It doesn't happen down the islands anymore. The Vineyard Derby doesn't even target striped bass anymore. It's not even like you see today's weigh-in at the Vineyard Derby, and the big fish caught is a 19-pound bluefish. Striped bass is not even a part of it. That was the mainstay for that tournament. That was the mainstay for the tournament, and so when we start to look at it, and it's hard because I sit on the board of directors and I know what this means, and I think there's a concern there that, geez, if we went catch and release, there's less tackle being bought, there's less, line being bought, there's less hardware, there's less, across the board for all of that, and then you start to see those captains that have gone full catch and release and they haven't seen a reduction in the amount of clients you're taking. They have waiting lists there. So, I wrestle with it. I get where you're coming from, the ASA. The science doesn't do it.
And I'm not saying that's even on the table right now, that we could accept some sort of different rebuilding choice to avoid no target enclosures. But when I think about where this fishery is headed, it makes me wonder, is that question coming if it's not already here? Because I think that that's really what we're grappling with. Because when you talk to a lot of these light tackle guides that sell trips on catch and release only, the first thing they say is, we oppose no target enclosures because it will have a huge impact on our business. 100%. But that's the same arguments that we're essentially making, saying, hey, we think status quo is the best option to minimize the economic impacts here, not just for a catch and release technique, but also for harvest as well. And remember, the assessment does not care which bucket those fish come from. So again, I think it's about trying to find fairness across the entire community in a scenario in which the conservation benefits of a reduction right now are really unclear. And I want to just put this in here in hopes that the figure will make it into the podcast here. Like, we are nowhere near where we were in the 80s when this thing was in big trouble. Now, we obviously have challenges with those poor year classes coming into the fishery, but the science, even though it's based on long-term projections, when they project the population out to 2035, that's 10 years from where we are now, they see more of a plateau in the population instead of a cliff. And I think anglers are thinking that a cliff is coming because those poor year classes are going to become part of our fishery and we're just not going to have enough fish to catch. But if the science is correct, the cliff is not being projected to be coming here. It's more of a plateau. And this is why I asked the question, over the longer term, are we willing to accept a slightly lower biomass level to avoid having to get really draconian
Hard
in
question
this
to answer,
fishery?
the one I'm going to ask you, but like in 1981, how many anglers were out there?
Oh, I would say, well, we should be able to have some data on this,
Right.
honestly.
I mean, our goal
But it should be less. You would think it would be less, right? We've been trying to grow the remember
our goal
60
was,
and 60?
Yeah,
like,
60
yeah,
and
this
60.
is it.
So it was 60 million anglers in 60 months. And we were skewing at 47, 48, and there was no end in sight for us to get to that 60. COVID hit, and the world went outside, and everything in the outdoor recreation world got a bump, and we jumped from 48 to 55, 54, 55. So all of a sudden that finish line looked like it was in reach. That since has scaled back substantially since that way. But just wondering, back in 1981, the electronics that I had on my boat in '92, there was none. There was no electronics. I had none. I mean, literally, I'm running a 20-foot.
Yeah, without doubt, the
shamrock.
fishery. Yeah, without doubt, the fishery these days is way more efficient. The fishery has changed in participation as well. And
Which is a great thing.
We're in the business of fishing. Hello, we're in the business of fishing. Right?
That's no complaint. But I always say, with great power comes great responsibility, and with the electronics that we have today, and the cell phone that's in your hand, there's no place for these fish to hide, because it doesn't take two people, removed from your immediate friend, and that word is spread like wildfire, right? Mm-hmm. It's hey, don't tell anyone, and it goes to the next one, and then that word's out there on social media, and such. And the electronics is such nowadays that when we were fishing out in Plymouth out there, I could shoot either side out 180 feet. I'm shooting 360 feet, driving in the dark, and it's like, and there they are. And then as soon as my boat stopped with the light on it, they're like, why did he stop? Let's go that way. But yeah, I digress. It's for the record, On the Water is completely not only opposed to a no target, right? That's it. We live somewhere between what ASA is status quo, and looking at as a company the catch and release. That's where we fall. That's for the record. And I'm a board of director at ASA and have been for the last 12, 13 years. But I look at it from the point of view of the fish is so important. We can't get it wrong. We just can't get it wrong.
Yeah, and I'll just provide our perspective, right? Is like in a scenario where it's seemingly intact, we're in this increasing population rebuild. Let's not get it wrong. Like, I think we can see that there's more to come over the next couple of years that will really tell us in a much more deterministic way what we need to do next.
Right.
And that may come. Look, Chris, at the end of the
You're just a lot closer to the edge, right? You're just a lot closer to that cliff than we are.
Possibly.
Because if you get it wrong,
but that's what I'm saying. You're not going to. But you're not going to, like, this isn't going to happen overnight.
No, I know that. I know.
So
that.
that's the point. Is like.
But the conversations we're having right now is not necessarily for 26. It's for
I
27.
feel like,
for 28.
right. But I feel like people feel like that's where we are, right? Like, we've been pushed to the edge of this cliff, and like, if we do not put up a fence that stops us from going over, we're all doomed. I just want to make sure.
Guardrail. That's why they're on cliffs.
Yeah, but still, those guardrails are intact. I mean, we're at a 30-year low in F. Like, there's
I get that.
There's some positives here that provide, I think, us a level of comfort that you guys may be in a different place on.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think there are hard questions that still need to be answered.
I agree.
That perhaps some of us are not ready to answer yet. And that's why I say, if that's the case, is there more information that we could get in the coming years? And look, that may mean
and
that
one of them, social media, right? How is it in today's world when we have report catches that social media is not a part of that? How is it like in today's world?
Yeah, and they're working.
Where digital like this, it's just, you would think that's up and down the coast. It's a lot easier for me to get back to the you know, I put away the boat and such. You sit there and it's like, okay, I'm a responsible angler. I haven't harvested fish in years. I'm responsible. I want to report that information.
Yeah.
You know, this is what I did. This is where I caught the fish. This is what it is. It's not going out on social media. It's going to somebody that can use that information, and they can use it in real time. You know,
yeah, and
versus a look back 2
no,
months.
those conversations are absolutely happening. It's not low hanging fruit
Right.
to get that information to be to a place where it could replace the survey that we currently have. And that sounds like it probably is hard to understand. It's like, well, come on, something's got to be better than basing it off of recall, right?
2 months of recall.
But there's a lot of diversity and participation in our sport. In order to really do what you're suggesting, it would require really high levels of participation from anglers. And where we've tested this in some fisheries where there are less anglers, like blue line tilefish, for example, and had mandatory catch reporting, it hasn't gone that well. Another example, which you're probably more familiar with, is bluefin tuna.
Yeah.
And so, remember,
that's a conversation.
There's a conversation for a different day, but it's very relevant, right? Because you have mandatory catch reporting in the bluefin tuna fishery, and yet we know compliance with that mandatory catch reporting is not the way it should be.
Right.
And so what you're talking about...
What is it, 24 hours to report your catch?
Exactly. What you're talking about is something that I think we are trying to move to, given the way the technology has changed. But it will require the angler to really step up and participate in that.
Boatmart is the online marketplace built to help you find your next boat. From the last fall striper blitz to next spring's first cast, Boatmart is here to get you on the water. With thousands of listings from fishing boats to pontoons, cruisers to sailboats, Boatmart has something for everyone. Listings from fishing boats to pontoons, cruisers to sailboats, Boatmart has something for every boater and every adventure. As the official marketplace partner of On the Water, we make it simple to find your next boat. Visit boatmart.com today to search for your next boat, or check them out in the classifieds tab on onthewater.com to find your next fishing boat.
Yeah, so in October, when the Striped Bass Board meets to decide final action on whether the 12% reduction should occur and how, etc., there will also be a board meeting for the Menhaden Management Board. And their agenda is to set catch levels for the Menhaden fishery in 2026 through 2028, so for the next 3 years. They're going to use the results of a benchmark stock assessment, 2 different assessments, one on Menhaden specifically, and the second one from an ecosystem assessment. Because remember, where we talked about earlier, The Menhaden fishery is currently managed with ecosystem reference points, and those ecosystem reference points are directly linked to striped bass, and not only just linked to striped bass rebuilding successfully to its target. And so I've gotten a glimpse of some of the results of those assessments that will be released in the coming weeks ahead of that October meeting. And what it is essentially showing is that a reduction in the catch level for menhaden is needed in order to successfully rebuild striped bass. And so the managers will be grappling with considering reducing the menhaden quotas in the coming years and what the impacts of that reduction will have on the menhaden fishery, one that doesn't involve the recreational fishing sector directly, but indirectly it involves us because that menhaden catch level and the reduction that they'll be looking at will be very meaningful to successfully rebuilding striped bass.
100%.
And remember, striped bass is not the only important predator that relies on menhaden. It just happens to be the one that we understand the best given all the science that have occurred around this. So the ecosystem assessment essentially uses striped bass as that indicator species for the ecosystem, but we know that menhaden is just as important to some of the other predators like tuna, for example.
Tuna.
Bluefish, yeah. So there's, I think, good opportunity to engage over in the coming weeks on this discussion that a lot of anglers have talked about over many years, which is, are we ensuring that the menhaden catch level is at an appropriate place to provide enough forage in the water to help our species like striped bass rebuild? And I think that there's been a growing sentiment that there hasn't been, that the catch levels have been too high. And the assessment is showing that that sentiment
That's been going on for years,
is more
years.
aligned. And it's hard, right? Because like this, it's them responding to new information. And so it's easy to be sort of an armchair quarterback and say, oh, well, you guys should have had this lower the whole time. But this new science, I think, is what would be considered sort of best available now. And there were some changes that occurred in that assessment that went through peer review, which is the scientific process to make sure that those are defensible results. And so that's coming for October as well. And the menhaden.
Will that be available on the ASA website? Like where?
Yeah,
like,
we're gonna.
So those folks that want to.
When that gets released, it's looking like the first week of October. So depending on when this podcast gets released, take a look. We'll be informing and engaging the community once that stuff is publicly available. I'm just speaking simply on the basis that I saw kind of some of the beginning results. And so once that stuff goes public, we will make sure that we inform our community about it because it's so important to this striped bass conversation.
100%. Kev, what do you got, buddy? You got an agenda over there. I feel like you have an agenda.
My agenda was just to get us talking. If we take one thing away from this, it's that striped bass management, or I guess all fishery management, it's not easy. It's complicated.
Not exact.
Your science is not perfect, but you got the best you can. With striped bass, thankfully, I think we know more and we have better science on striped bass than most fish species, which is good. But it's hard. You've got managers there. It's not black and white. It's not that you've got some evil managers who just want to kill striped bass and some that just want to conserve. It's everybody's trying to balance the needs of all stakeholders. That's the name of the game. And there's no simple answers. None of us, I don't think, are happy with the fact that there's not as many striped bass around as there have been in the past. We'd all like to see more. None of us want no targeting closures. That just seems like that doesn't solve anything and it just hurts everyone.
Right.
But it's not an easy decision, and the good thing is the public is encouraged to provide feedback. ASMFC.org is the place to go. They actually have now, for the first time I've ever seen, a survey there, a digital survey, so you don't have to go and draft up a a letter about what you think. You can go in there and answer the survey, straightforward questions, and let them know what you think. They really encourage public participation.
We should link that to our site, Kev. Let's put it right on the front. I think that's really important. Let's make it available to as many, of our audience as possible. Let's see. I think they're active, and I think they tune into that.
Yeah, and we don't try to speak for everybody, but we try to let everybody know that there's opportunities to chime in and kind of give them as much of the facts and what we understand as possible, and then just encourage you, hey, go and speak up. Let managers know what you think about this and what you want to see, and hopefully the managers will do the best job they can at making things fair and equitable and rebuilding striped bass.
And to your point, Kev, I think it's really important to state here that when I speak as the owner and publisher and you speak as the editor-in-chief, we're not speaking for the on-the-water community. I can't do that. I don't know where everyone stands. I can just speak for myself, and I can't even speak for my staff. I know for the most part where they stand, but I can't speak for my staff. I can speak for myself. And in kind of my years and experience with it.
There's a lot of different types of fishermen out there, but there's also not as much division as I think it gets painted sometimes.
I agree.
I think every striped bass fisherman I know is a catch and release angler. Maybe not 100% of the time,
right?
But everybody out there enjoys catching and releasing striped bass, and even if you're trying to take one home, you're also catching and releasing fish while you're doing that. We're all in the same boat in many ways.
Yeah. So I just want to challenge you on that a little bit. Like, what would your message be to your readership because there's obviously going to be a lot of diversity of opinion here. And so I think it's a matter of the job here as an advocate is to advocate for your position. I don't view it as your position is more right than somebody else's. It's what you believe to be sort of supported by your experience and what you know about the situation. It's okay if somebody arrives at a different conclusion than you. And I think what would be your message to the audience to participate in a way that would take away a little bit of the tension that you recognize is kind of in existence right now, which is the community seems like it's a little bit more at odds with each other than, frankly, I think it needs to be. And the managers are picking up on that. And so I was just curious, do you have kind of a message to your readers and
the
listeners
message that we've
been
putting out there, for one, is that no target closures is something that is on the table. And I don't, I don't think there's many, I haven't met anyone yet who says, I think it's a good idea. So letting our audience know that is a very real thing that is on the table. I mean, it's in the document. They're thinking about it. So that's one thing. Whatever you think about it, it's there. And really I've always just tried to encourage our audience, get involved, learn what you want. You might end up in a different place than I am in, but I want you to be informed. I don't want you to be taken by surprise next year and find out, hey, when did they close the striper season and tell me I can't target them? Where did this come from? I had no idea. To me, as a media publication in the fishing world, that's our job, is to get the word out there to let people know that this discussion is happening, that these questions are being asked, that they're on the table, and that you have an opportunity to speak up right now.
I'm always going to side more on the side of caution. I'm just, because of what this fish means, I'm going to side on the side of caution. So when we're having this conversation the entire time, I get ASA stance. I understand it. It all makes sense, right? It makes sense. That doesn't mean, in my heart, I'm not going to side towards that. And sometimes it's hard for that not to come out in whatever I say or if I write or whatever that might be, that I'm going to be on the side of caution, because I said earlier, we can't get this wrong. We can't. And so, when we start talking about guardrails, I'm a little further I'm a little further away from the edge than you are, that way. And there's degrees of how far we can get before we're going over a cliff. And I tend to stay a little bit more towards the middle of the road in this one.
One thing that I love about coming up here for Striper Fest is the diversity that I know exists in this striped bass fishery. Yeah. Is perfectly on display at Striper Fest. And I think in the Striper Cup tournament, you have anglers across the entire spectrum in that tournament, even though it's a catch and release tournament. And so that's something that I find really valuable, is getting the opportunity to come and engage with that diversity at this event. And I don't come pushing an agenda. I try to get to know who these individuals are so that they can tell me who they are instead of me telling them who they should be. And that's what I really value about this event and what it means to, honestly, the broader discussion on where we go with this striped bass fishery. It happens to be very convenient that right now we are in the midst of this challenging decision on what to do. And so I'm looking forward to, getting that opportunity to really pick people's brains because they spend time at the booth with us. That's the best part.
You get 2,500 to 3,000 anglers that are passionate, that want to come up here, that want to travel from anywhere from Virginia north and from Canada south and from the entire greater Northeast and Mid-Atlantic community to come here, and they want to celebrate striped bass, right? That way. One other thing I would like to do, just as a plug to ASA and what you folks do, and I think sometimes this is missed. When ASA started, it was a manufacturers trade group. That's what it was. ASA was the American Sportfishing Association, started as a manufacturers trade group. So it was going to be all of the manufacturers across the board that way. ASA is no longer a manufacturers trade group, and proof in the pudding of that is, here I am running a media company, and I chaired that board for 2 years. I was honored to chair that board. The chairman of the board right now is also a publisher with Midwest Outdoors, Dan Ferris. And I think it speaks to the diversity of the board there now, where you have X amount of folks that are manufacturers, you have X amount of the media, you have X amount that are representative groups. And it really, you have the folks that are on the retail side of it. And just, it really speaks to the diversity of that group. And I don't think that's recognized enough. And the other thing I would say is that ASA has done a great job in addition to the policy, folks like yourself there, the 4 or 5 policy, the lobbyists that we have, the group that we work with in DC, because you can scream in social media all you want, but if you don't have the lobbyists on Capitol Hill that are working through, whether or not with our PAC that we started and with the lobbyists that we have in there, they're not necessarily hearing you that way. And so there's just a lot of great work, what you guys are doing down there. I'm proud to be a part of it. And I think it just speaks to the diversity of that board is a microcosm of the membership that we have in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as the government affairs guy, trying to thread that needle is right where we work, That's right where we work. Right. And we're not niche. We have to represent the entire industry on these issues. And that's where the challenge lies. And I think that does get lost, honestly.
It does.
And because the anglers don't necessarily know that diversity. They know kind of what the fisheries are that they participate in and what they love. And that diversity exists across our industry. And I still just am even blown away myself at how diverse our membership is coming into this as the saltwater guy. It's like there's the freshwater side is huge. Yeah. The saltwater side is big too. And it's like the combination of those things and the different value sets that people bring is what makes it kind of challenging to find the best pathway forward to the association. But again, our mission is very, it is abundant fisheries, it is recreational fishing access, and the combination of those two things, trying to find that middle ground. And that's basically aligns perfectly with how our fisheries are managed and the laws that drive that management. So of course that's going to swing back and forth with the different perspectives in play. But we've honored having you guys be a big part of that, not only at the board level, but having Kevin on our government affairs committee as well. And Kevin can tell you those conversations, they can be. Yeah,
I mean, we talked once, and I think I'm going to try and land the plane and wrap this up.
I was going to say, I was looking
to We talked once about how on the fishing side of things, we don't have what you have necessarily on the hunting or the gun side of things, but they have the NRA, and everybody speaks with one unified voice, and it is pro-gun. And fishing, I wish we were that sort of strong and unified, but on the other hand, I'm kind of glad we're not. I'm kind of glad that, maybe we don't have the political power, but I'm glad that we have so many different opinions and feelings and thoughts. And ASA does their best to kind of corral it and figure out what's best. But above all, we go down to Capitol Hill and we get in front of our senators and we talk to politicians and we say, hey, recreational fishing is a big deal. It means a lot to us in both personally and then also as a business. It's not just a guy sitting on the bank drinking a beer, dunking a worm. Some of it's that, but it's also this much bigger thing. I mean, we all know, especially folks here down the water, like, we spend a lot of money to go and catch fish, even if we're just catching and releasing them. It's a big deal, and ASA helps kind of put that in front of the people who are going to make decisions that affect our hobby and our way of life, and I really appreciate that. So I think we'll...
Yeah, no, that last thing I would say is we are lucky to have Mike on the East Coast. If you know Mike Waine, he's a fisherman too. Oftentimes in some of these positions in these different organizations, the person is not necessarily, that's not the interest or the love of the sport that they are, but they work in that thing. And I think one of the things that we're fortunate to have is you love fishing. We're going to be fishing next week. You're out on Nantucket.
Absolutely,
and I think that when you live where you work, and that's, in that, I think you can speak a lot closer to where we're going and the truth of that. But Mike Waine, pleasure to have you as always, man. I love you.
Yeah.
And you do a great job. We're lucky to have you on the East Coast.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I appreciated the discussion.